families. Death penalty cases are interesting from victims because people naturally assume that most victims want that, and it turns out not to be the case. A lot of victims, they don't favor the death penalty and sometimes plea on behalf of the offender not to put them to death for religious reasons or just because they're opposed to it and don't want to feel like they're responsible for it in any way. And prosecutors and judges are often instructed not to take the victim's wishes into account, which is just, I think, it's crazy. I mean, it's true that you can't ask the dead person what they want, but if the victim's family is unified around not wanting it, to think that that's not relevant to what the sentence should be seems to me to be offensive to the interests of the victim. But our system isn't designed to take the victim's interests into account at all.
Right. We could scale that down. I went straight for death penalty there. That might have been ambitious, but the story that so many people mistakenly believe, and I think you tripped Sam Harris up on this, that the people who occupy our prisons, if we could only get nonviolent drug offenders out of prison, then we would really be in a good position there. Yeah. And on one hand, that doesn't address the ideas through which that got people in prison in the first place,
right,
or the systems in which got them there. But also, there's a myth here that it's not that locking up drug offenders is a great thing. It's just that enforcing strict retributive consequences to all violent offenders is a useful thing to do. That's the mythology. And actually,
well, the myth is that, to be clear, the myth is that like 50% of the people in prisons are there for nonviolent drug offenders, and it's way lower than that. Like it's like 8 or 7 or 8% or lower than that. The 50% figure comes from federal prison because a lot of people are locked in federal prisons, but federal prisons are a very small percentage of the total prison population.
Right. Okay. So the statistical myth is that, right? That you could just free all of what we call nonviolent drug offenders, and that would, you might not notice that it's really put a dent on the problem that we're trying to solve.
Exactly.
There's still an idea that comes from over-focusing or hyper-focusing on drug offenders that are nonviolent that can trip you up too. Because first you mentioned plea deals happening, and a lot of plea deals from violent offenses get dropped where drugs are concerned to cases that might look like nonviolent offenses.
Right.
But also, why would violence need to mean that the person deserves the harshest penalty?
Right.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, how do you see a good way forward for people who have committed violent crimes to be able to land in justice that both helps them overcome some of the worst behaviors that they exhibited, but also is restorative?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think people like to say, yeah, it's horrible that we're locking up all these people for having like an ounce of weed on them or something like that. And if we, we could just address this problem by freeing those people, and it just wouldn't, right? Like as bad as our system is, the vast majority of people who are in prison have committed a violent crime of some sort. And so how do you deal with them? I think you have to be able to offer these people a path to be reintegrated within society if we are going to address this problem. And what that fundamentally requires is for people to just accept that maybe you let this person out after they've served a reasonable sentence, and maybe they commit another violent crime and somebody is harmed by that. So it requires us to just not be so risk averse that we can't even wrap our heads around the possibility that, once we let somebody out of prison, they may commit a violent crime because they have in the past. That's just a fundamental fact that unless we're just going to lock up everybody forever, that's what's going to, we have to accept that. And then we have to figure out, well, what can we do to make it less likely that will happen? And I think restorative justice is one of those things that we can do to make it less likely that it'll happen, because, both for victims and offenders, people can be kind of abstractions, you know? Offenders can look at victims as, you know, some guy I robbed or some guy I held up or some guy I beat the shit out of. But when you actually look at the people and their family who you've harmed, unless you're some sort of sociopath, and there are sociopaths, but unless you are that, you're going to feel like, oh, wait, this actually had consequences. I did something that actually hurt somebody in ways that I wasn't intending to or expecting. And if they show you respect, and for a lot of these guys in prison, people haven't shown them respect their whole lives. And if the victims show them respect, now they feel like, okay, well, you know, maybe I should try to figure out a different way of making my way through this life where all the advantages seem like they're denied to me. And like, I just, you know, if you look at restorative justice recidivism rates versus non-restorative justice recidivism rates, it's dramatic. The statistics, it goes from like 75% recidivism rates dropping to like 20, 10, depending on the domain, depending on the type of crime. And these statistics, it's hard to know what to trust and what not to trust. But that is a general trend, and that is one way of handling it. Another way, but it's not the only way. There are plenty of other ways to make sure, to try to give offenders who are released from prison a way of reintegrating into society that doesn't require that they commit more crimes. Moving them away from their neighborhood, giving them a job with responsibilities, job training. There's an organization that I work with here. I haven't worked with them in a while, but it was called the Prisoners Entrepreneurial Program in Houston, and there's also a branch in Dallas. And they would take prisoners who are going to be released between 1 and 3 years from then, and they put them through a whole program, get them to design their own company, which is hard because they don't have access to the internet, and then, you know, give them job training skills, etiquette training skills, and then a place to live when they get out that is away from the neighborhood that they committed their offense in. And they do this with people up to, you know, even murderers. They do this, and they have remarkable success, remarkable lack of recidivism rates. That's not restorative justice, but it is a communal building thing that is, you know, it's really beautiful. That one is inspired by a religious orientation. It's very fundamentally based in Christian values, but it has a lot of the same kinds of community building things that you find in honor cultures.
You asked me earlier why I think that, you know, receding from the zero tolerance policies hasn't quite caught up in a practical sense. And then you suggested, you know, maybe there's this top-down sort of influence that makes it difficult to happen. You know, a through line in the book that I wrote recently is that, and it's about addiction and why people become addicted, is that people behave in better ways when they have the resources and skills available to meet life's demands. And that just seems so, it's like, what a stupid book. How obvious is that? The problem is that we can't seem to wrap our minds around how to do that in a practical sense. John Pfaff, who I think you cite.
Yeah, I think he's the one who brought those violent, you know, like the violent crimes versus nonviolent crime stats to my attention.
Right. I've been deep in his work now, and he mentions that one of the circular problems that we have is that we tend as an electorate to value like this hard-hitting approach on district and state's attorneys. Mm-hmm. So we elect attorneys that will, you know, follow through with the promise that these violent criminals will get what's coming to them. And then we get that because we voted for it. And it makes it really difficult to to begin this process that you're talking about. I don't know if you have ideas about where we would start in terms of making this work.
Yeah, I'm not a policy person. I don't know how. I do think like the rhetoric around this issue could be fine-tuned in a way that's kind of informed by honor. I mean, frankly, I think that like if you are so concerned about a violent offender being released back into society, you're kind of a pussy. And like that kind of, you're just a coward. You're afraid. You want to live life with no risk of being harmed at all. And I don't know, like if you frame it that way, maybe the public sentiment can be, because nobody likes to be called a coward, the public sentiment could be, I don't know, transformed to be a little bit more like, make people feel like, yeah, they might be taking a risk to help their fellow human being, but that's a risk that somebody who has some self-respect and some guts and some courage should be more than willing to take. And if you aren't that, then that's shameful. You should be ashamed of yourself. This is, I think in the book I was more focused on refugees because that was the issue of the time. But it was just, that was such a disgrace the way people were reacting to, Syrian refugees, these people who are fleeing from their lives because of us, by the way. But even if that weren't true, and everyone was saying, well, what if they, become a terrorist? They start a terrorist cell. This tiniest minuscule possibility was making everybody wet their pants. Like, that's how people should talk about that attitude. Is it's not that they're being overcautious, they're being pussies, and call them out for that. And maybe that would work in this kind of case, and maybe it would make it so that the prosecutor who runs doesn't have to act all tough, like I'm going to throw these people away for life to get elected. But again, I don't know. Yeah, I'd like to think that's true, but I don't know if it's true.
Yeah, well, I mean, that someone's going to have to make that happen, I guess. I'm sorry if I didn't mean to ask you a question out of your jurisdiction.
I talk out of my jurisdiction on a daily basis. Like, what do you think our podcast is? We're not Borges scholars. We're not, but so I'm always happy to do that. I would like to see somebody try that. I'd love to see a prosecutor try that tack. When he's being accused or she's being accused of being soft on crime, to actually get people to think about what that means. That you're saying that you're making that accusation, what that means about what kinds of risks you're willing to undertake. And I think maybe people would be surprised to see that tack would work, because it's appealing to these kinds of more honor-oriented values that I think a lot of people have still stirring in them, even if they don't recognize it.
Well said. You did mention that since writing this book, you've done more work and more thinking about the legal system and restorative justice. Any new ideas or beliefs that you've adopted that you'd be willing to talk about?
I don't think I could, not in the time that we have left. I have been really thinking about, we haven't gotten into the sort of philosophy and the theoretical apparatus behind the current system that we have. And one of the things I think that is a big obstacle to restorative justice being accepted is dismantling that theoretical apparatus, which is philosophically a real disgrace. There's no foundations for it. It has this kind of veneer of fairness and objectivity, but when you try to actually dig deep into the details of it, it's just it's a complete illusion. And it's a comforting illusion to some people, but one of the things I have tried to do in more recent, since the book, but also in the book actually, is to show, kind of unmask the pretense of a strong philosophical foundation for the criminal justice system that we currently have. And then, and this is fuzzier because restorative justice doesn't have that kind of, it doesn't aspire to this theoretical, systematized foundation, to make people comfortable with that, to the fact that, because I think this is something honor cultures and honor norms and systems of values, they don't pretend, this I like this about them, they don't pretend to have some sort of grand philosophical justification. And I think we as a society, want the pretense of that, even if it's not real. We want the pretense of it. We expect it. And if a system doesn't even have the pretense of it, then we're comfortable ignoring it, no matter what the defects of the current system and how poorly articulated the justifications are for that system. We'll still prefer it because ideally we imagine it could be implemented in a way that would be just. And so, there's two sides of that. There's showing that the emperor has no clothes for like retributive and approach to criminal justice. That's the easy part. The hard part is getting people to be comfortable with a system that doesn't even pretend to have clothes in that way. I don't know. I'm probably bungling that metaphor, but that's the way I would like to. That's one of my ambitions for future work, future research.
Some sort of a system in which, we don't have to have the devil we know mentality, and we also can grant people's wishes to have something that's sort of concrete, so that it's not too confusing.
Or to not have some sort of objective foundation. Like, we don't expect that we don't expect baseball, the rules of baseball, to have some sort of objective foundation. We get that it's a system that is made up and sort of built and constructed as we go along, and when we see certain flaws in the system, we try to fix those, make it better, but there's not some objective justification that we can give, and we're fine with that when it comes to a lot of things, but not when it comes to something like criminal justice. And the fact is, there is no good philosophical objective foundation for punishing people. That's not it's a fool's errand to try to justify it at that level. And I think we really do need to think of it more as what's the best sort of system that we can construct to deal with the fact that some people will commit crimes, and we have to figure out how to deal with that. But to look at it as a practical problem and not a problem that we need some sort of idealized, abstract philosophical justification for.
That just dawned on me that, I ask you, what is honor? And your response is, in part, that's kind of the wrong question.
Yeah.
You might turn that to someone who has this idea of what justice is and ask them, what is justice?
Yeah.
You run into that same problem, so you need solutions to match it.
It's the wrong question, right? You can't give some general abstract answer to that question, but you can show somebody justice porn.
Or revenge porn, whatever you're into.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much for taking time to talk about the book. It's one of those books that it's a concept I've been thinking about, haven't put the words to, and you've not only, allowed an inroad to thinking more deeply about those things. You put it in terms I couldn't have possibly thought about. So people should buy Why Honor Matters in print. If you're listening to Tamler, I enjoyed the audiobook, but
okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. I listened to a little bit of it and I was like, oh my God, I was horrified, but maybe that's just, I wasn't used to hearing myself.
I'm doing an audiobook right now, and I just hate my voice. It's so counterintuitive because I'm doing a podcast, but anyway.
Right.
Yeah, I guess you too.
Me too.
And that's the other thing. You should listen to Very Bad Wizards. It's more people know about Very Bad Wizards than they do my show. But if you're a listener of this show and you enjoy the content but think I'm boring, you should definitely listen to Very Bad Wizards. It's neither it's both intelligent and it's definitely not boring. So anywhere else that I can link people to if they want to follow you more closely or your work?
Well, I have a website, but I haven't updated it in a while. But yeah, TamlerSommers.com. Yeah, check out the podcast, check out the book, and I really appreciate you having me on. This was a lot of fun.
All right, thank you so much. I'll link to those in the show notes. Hopefully we'll talk again soon.